1, 2. Good morning. I'm Terry Roselle with the Department of Bioethics and with the Center for Practical Bioethics. Welcome to those of you who are coming in via online or watching this as a video at some time in the future. This is the 5th in our series of lectures that we call Current Issues in Bioethics. And we are privileged today to have with us Dr. Ryan Neuhofel. I'm sorry to say to those of you who are medical students in your, third semester, that there are too many physicians out there who completed medical school and hate their jobs. Dr. Neuhofel, or Dr. New, as he prefers to be called, I think decided that he was not going to be one of those casualties, and so took things into his own hands and created a model for him of being a physician that I think makes you happy as well as makes your patients happy.
I hope so.
Yeah, and so it's a very interesting model, somewhat controversial in around ethics circles. And that's why we invited Dr. New to come and talk to you about direct primary care, which is not concierge medicine, he will tell you, but looked like it when I first looked at it. He is a graduate of this institution and practices in Lawrence, and he'll tell you more about himself. Dr. New.
Thank you. Thank you. My laser pointer works. You know, it's been a long time since I've been up here. I think it's been like 6 months, and I miss my laser pointer, so I might just do this a lot. So thank you guys again for having me, and thank you for the introduction. Let me make sure this is the right clicker. Here I am, looking like professors up here already. I mean, didn't think it would come to this. How do we go to the next slide? No. AV guy, don't know. Oh, there it goes. Maybe it was just being slow. Okay, great. Sorry. I'm off to a great start though, right? As he mentioned, I'm a family physician. I have a pretty unique practice in the direct primary care model in Lawrence. For those of you who don't know, that's about 45 minutes west of here. It's the greatest place east or west of the Mississippi. So if you're not from the area, you should definitely go there and hang out some evening and wave at me when you go by. So I have a pretty unique practice, and so most of what I'm going to do today is share with you my experience in creating that practice, why I did that, what my practice is all about, but you're also supposed to learn some stuff today and not hear me talk about just myself. So here's the learning objectives, and I'll let you review those now. So my story. So I graduated from this institution in 2008. And did my intern year in Phoenix, Arizona, ended up finishing residency at University of Kansas, just down the road here in 2011. And what I learned very early on, and this is probably starting just ahead of where you guys are at now, was that I loved learning about medicine. I loved pathophysiology. I know I'm a nerd. I loved all of that nerdy stuff. I love people for the most part. You know, people can be challenging. I guess I knew that before going into medicine. But as I got into my 3rd and 4th year, I learned that I really hated learning about the business and the administrative side of medicine and healthcare. And if you talk to some of your 3rd and 4th year students, they'll probably echo that. And so I decided to do this kind of weird thing, at least at the time. I knew when I went through my my training, as I got in, especially into later medical school and early in residency, what I wanted professionally, personally, was to develop long-lasting relationships with my patient. I think all doctors want to do that, no matter what specialty they go into, but this is particularly true, I think, in primary care. I wanted autonomy to practice my philosophy. and that sounds a little bit like being a cowboy, but what I mean by that is I wanted some freedom. I'm a very evidence-based guy. I have a degree in public health before medical school, but I wanted to be able to take care of my patients in the way that I saw best for them. I think I'm a pretty creative guy. I've always liked art and creating stuff, design. So I wanted a little bit of a creative outlet. I wanted some financial security. I think a lot of students and doctors feel uncomfortable in saying that because medicine is an altruistic profession. And by considering finances, I didn't mean I wanted to be fabulously wealthy. If I did want to be fabulously wealthy, I'm an idiot because I picked primary care. But I did want some sense of kind of an ability to take care of my family and pay off my student loans and all of those things that I'm sure some of you guys are already thinking about. And I discovered, as I went through my clinical experiences, that the traditional system, and this in most respects, discouraged most of those things that I wanted. It discouraged continuity in relationship. I did meet doctors and patients who'd had 5, 10, 25-year relationships, but it was increasingly rare. People bounced around from provider to provider because of various systems and things. I saw that traditional models created a lot of moral hazards, that the doctors felt hamstrung to make the best decisions. They were rushed. There's a lot of kind of angst both on the part of the physician and the patient because of those constraints. I saw that for the most part, practices and hospitals were much more focused on following regulations and rules, obligations, rather than creatively meeting the needs of their patients. And I saw, especially in the primary care world, that there was a really uncertain financial future. I guess that's what all of this political banter is about in most physician organizations. But more than all of that was I really felt like often, and this isn't always, but often the patients didn't get what they deserved. And this is not necessarily the fault of the individual providers. They cared deeply about their patients, particularly in the primary care world. But because of all these various constraints, that patients often walked away from their care confused, left out in the cold, fell through the cracks. I saw these patients all the time. And I did see physicians who were making tremendous sacrifices in order to care for their patients. And sometimes that could overcome those odds, but oftentimes even that wasn't enough. So my path to doing direct primary care, I think pretty early on, probably even second, third year in med school, I decided I wanted to do something independent, private practice. I didn't want to work for the man, whoever that might be for you. I didn't work for any of those. So I started studying kind of the traditional practice management stuff. I was the idiot on general surgery with the practice management journal. It didn't help my suturing skills. But so I was kind of trying to study, like, how does a business work? If I want to own my own practice, how's this coding and billing? And this all sounds weird to me in a whole other language that I wasn't learning in medical school. So how does that all work? So I again, experienced the spectrum of practice settings: rural clinics, private clinics, suburban, urban clinics, academia, and all of them in some respects had major drawbacks. There are certain aspects I liked, but other aspects I couldn't see myself doing. And I discovered some alternative models. The first clinic that I remember reading about that kind of was a real eye-opener was a place called Q Lions in Seattle, a doctor named Garrison Bliss, who's kind of one of the grandfathers. He'll let me call him that. He's older than I am. So Garrison was kind of one of the first people in the country to use the phrase direct primary care. And I think he was kind of calling it an affordable concierge, but was very reasonable and had this amazing practice that got profiled in several places. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. Like that's what I want to do. I don't want to do this other practice management stuff I'm learning about. So I researched this idea as much as possible, but really there wasn't a lot out there in 2009, 2010, 2011. There was a handful of clinics around the country that were practicing in a model that now looks a lot like mine. So I really just kind of decided that I wanted to start with a clean slate whenever I got the chance. So I'm going to speak from my experience here. And so the problems with kind of traditional primary care, I mentioned some of them. I think the doctor problems are, first and foremost, increasing complexity and cost of doing business. All of those forms and all of those papers that don't seem to make a lot of sense when you see doctors, spending hours and hours after work. Most of the time that has to do with business, not clinical stuff. They're not sitting there writing timelines about their patient's diabetes to help them understand it. There's a lot of non-compensated work. A lot of primary care doesn't happen sitting there talking to the patient, but it's coordination of care, referrals, communicating with patients by phone, on call after hours. A lot of that wasn't really compensated. There was declining compensation. Primary care, on average, makes 50% less than most specialists, sometimes less than that. There was increasing patient volumes because of various forces. The average panel size for a primary care doctor has steadily grown in recent decades. Most estimates are that 2,000 to 4,000 patients per provider is normal. So when you wonder why people can't get an appointment, it's because doctors are trying to care for a lot of people. And we have ways we can get around that, hiring physician extenders and these type of things. But there's a huge burden of patients, and that's a relatively modern phenomenon for primary care. And ultimately, all of this stuff above has led to what we now call physician burnout. I'm sure you guys have at least been exposed to this, where physicians are unhappy. There's a loss of interest in primary care because of an increase in burnout. The patient problems, as I said, I tried to think about this as much as I could from the patient's perspective. Increasing costs. We have steadily increased the rates of insurance in America, which on the face of it is a good thing, but that doesn't mean that patients aren't struggling with costs. So when they actually need medical care, the amount of financial burden on the patients has steadily increased, even though we have more insurance than ever. People have difficulty actually getting the care. So even if they're not worried about the cost, if people call in the morning and they can't get an appointment for 2 weeks, that's difficult to define that as good access. There's decreased time with the primary care provider. Most people don't even realize what the potential scope of care that primary care providers can provide, because they spend on average 7 to 8 minutes with their primary care. It's really hard to provide a broad spectrum of care in 7 to 8 minutes. There is fragmented and disjointed care. So when you don't have enough time, what do? Well, you make referrals. You send people to the urgent care. You send people to the ER. And the primary care doctor is still supposed to be there being the quarterback, but the truth is there's too many people and too much fragmentation for that to occur. I think the challenge is, again, about continuity. Patients have trouble keeping the same provider because of physician burnout, changing jobs, changing insurance plans. People, for various reasons, can't even keep the same doctor that they had 2 or 3 years ago, often. And so there's been a lot of stuff from high levels, from DC, from various states, regulatory, legislative efforts that have tried to fix this stuff. I won't review all of them today, but I think some of them in some respects have been helpful, but for the most part, all of those problems I list still exist and are worsening. So I kind of I call this being a pessimist, but I looked at the future of primary care and said, I'm not confident this system would be fixed by the powers that be, and namely restoring the value and importance of primary care, at least not with some physicians on the ground level doing something. So I mentioned direct primary care a few times. So what is it? As I mentioned, some of the practices, probably the first one started in the mid to late 2000s. There are variations in the model, but there are now legal definition of direct primary care at federal and about 25 state levels. And the three main components of it, and most people would agree to this, is that it's direct. There's no insurance or third-party contracts or billing. That it's a fixed periodic payment to the physician or clinic to provide primary care services. We often call this a subscription, a membership, a retainer. And any fees that may be charged for visits are less than the monthly membership fee. Most of them charge $0, such as myself, but some of them do have like a small $10, $20 scheduling fee. Oop. Okay. I just say this up front. It's not concierge medicine, and more and more so, I don't have to say this, but I'm still going to say it. So when I describe my practice and what my practice was going to be for the first 5 or 6 years, that's the immediate response I get. And I totally understand that because, some of the things that we do in our practice, which I'll get to, sound a lot like concierge medicine. We provide a really high level of service. Concierge medicine has been around, I say since the 1980s or 90s, but really it's been around since the existence of time. I'm pretty sure the President of the United States has had concierge medicine since the Revolution. But so what concierge medicine is, to give it a definition, although this is harder because there is no legal definition like there is with DPC, most concierge doctors are charging a retainer fee for improved access, and that fee is for non-covered services, meaning that it doesn't cover actual medical care like my clinic does, and patients, for the most part, are still billing their insurance. So if you have an insurance plan, you go to this doctor, you pay them an extra amount, and it's usually thousands of dollars, anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000 a year, and they will limit their panel size and provide same-day visits, longer appointments, these type of things, which my clinic also does. But on top of that, they're billing their insurance plan. So if you come in and you have diabetes and you have to be seen, they're still going to bill your insurance plan. The doctor's still billing an insurance plan. But that kind of retainer fee is apart from the insurance system, which is obviously different than what DPC is doing. Okay, evolving definitions. Again, as I said, there actually are quite a few legal definitions and some light regulations emerging about DPC. The original DPC definition was actually in the state of Washington, where Dr. Bliss, I said, opened his practice. And direct primary care is included in the Affordable Care Act, and that surprises a lot of people. There is a clause in the Affordable Care Act, which is 2009 that it was passed. This says that direct primary care can participate in health insurance exchanges with a wrap health plan. Now, that really didn't take ground in most places because of how slow bureaucracies work, but there are a few examples of how that kind of functioned, and unfortunately, a lot of those examples have turned south, which I might talk a little about. So like I said, 18 and pending. I think this is from last year. I think we're up to 23 or 25. And for the most part, the laws are just to clarify that me charging my patients in the way that I do is not health insurance. So my practice, it's called New Care. It's in Lawrence, as I mentioned. It's member supported. My average per member per month is $43. So if you add up all my patients and what they pay, that's about what it averages out. Individuals and adults and seniors pay slightly different rates, and families get a huge discount because I'm a family doc and I want families. I want them to sign up, and I love kids. About 24% of my practice is pediatrics, which is awesome percentage for a family doctor, at least in a semi-urban area. Like I said, it's structured very much like a gym membership. People sign up on a month-to-month basis. There's no annual commitment. People can join, and it's just a monthly ongoing thing. The membership fee covers most routine primary care services, which I'll cover here. So what that means is any communications with me or my clinic, my nurse, by phone, email, text message, clinic visits, as many and often as you need, many routine labs, so point of care tests like strep tests, urine test, urine pregnancy, some basic labs like CBCs and lipid panels and stuff. We basically comp for patients and don't charge them. Medical equipment lease, we kind of run kind of like a co-op program for that. So we have crutches and blood pressure machines and stuff that people might need temporarily but not permanently. We just let them use that and take it home and bring it back to us. I believe in flu shots so much, I buy them and just give them to my patients. And one of the coolest things that we do, because we're member supported, is kind of like Costco. Anything that we charge beyond this that's not included is at cost. And so we give discounts on things like labs, meds, procedures, diagnostic imaging. And so we get rates for these that are crazy, crazy low. Most labs are $5 to $10. Radiology, example, x-rays, $25 to $30 to my clinic. Meds we buy at wholesale price, same way the pharmacies do, but we don't mark them up. So a lot of generic meds are less than $1 a month. So huge savings, anywhere from 50 to 95% on those type of things. For procedures, we only charge for the cost of the equipment. So if I do a wound repair, it's $10 because that's about what it costs me for the syringe and the suture and the lidocaine. And I'd probably even mark that up a little bit, but I don't want to charge them $6.32 because I'm lazy. So basically, when you add that all up, we break even on ancillary charges. So kind of like Costco. Most of our profit and revenue comes from the membership fee, and everything else we break even on. So some things we do that are pretty unique, and this is, I think, where the kind of, oh, that's concierge medicine. sadly, because we've set the standard so dang low in traditional primary care. So we do remote communication and care, and what that means, as I mentioned, people can communicate with us in whatever way they feel appropriate with permission. They can text me and email me and call me. Did that 3 or 4 times this morning with text messages. I'm on call basically 24/7. My patients, if they need to reach me, they can call my cell phone. We do same or next day visits. Our visits are much longer, particularly for new or complicated patients. We'll probably average around 30 to 60 minutes. We don't want to keep people in the clinic just so they can hear all of my bad jokes. But, so we're efficient, but we also spend time with people when they need it. I'll do house calls when they're reasonably necessary. I don't do house calls for like stub toes, but if it's a really sick person, newborn, elderly person, post-op, that type of thing, I'll go in and do house calls. It's too cold for this clicker. Need some more RAM. Oh, there we go. Okay, so there's some variation in DPC practices. Most DPC practices around the country, and I think I go into this later, estimates are there's 600 to 800 practices, but I think that's growing by hundreds even in the next few months, are small, solo, 1 or 2 providers. But there are a few examples of large groups. Some of these larger groups are the ones that have ended up in the media. And some of them have done some things that don't quite fit the DPC mold, but some DPC practices, including my own, work with employers to sponsor membership. So I think I talk a little about that later. Membership fees will vary. So my membership fee is about $43, but you'll see anywhere from $30 to about $150 a month. There's no authority that says we must or can charge this amount, but what I have seen in the last 6 years is the fees have steadily come down because it's becoming a little bit more of a competitive market. So most new practices I see are in the $60 to $80 range or less per month all across the country. Most will include, like I said, most of these services or some variation of these without any other fees, and most don't have visit fees. Most of them will provide the discounts for labs and meds and imaging. There's a few states that restrict some of these things that can make it difficult, but where possible, most practices do this. Well, what about insurance? So I think this is probably the biggest misperception is when I describe what I do as a primary care doctor and how my business and practice is structured, a lot of people say, well, that works unless you get run over by a bus. And that's true. I rarely run out in the street and fix people when they get run over by a bus. I haven't seen that happen yet, but the proverbial bus. So DPC, and I'll speak for myself here, is not anti-insurance. I realize that insurance is a necessary thing. It's a financial tool. The last I checked, insurance companies are a financial institution. They're not a health provider. And so I'm not anti-insurance. I think we could use insurance in a lot smarter way. And I think you really get into a lot of the language here, which I'll do later. Really, we don't have an insurance system in America. For the most part, we have a managed care system. If you've ever heard of an MCO, an HMO, a PPO, there's an example of where you pay all of your healthcare dollars to an institution, private or public, and then they manage all of those dollars for you. So in other circumstances of our lives, we wouldn't use the term insurance in this setting. I like to call it micromanaged care. And then there's real world insurance products right now that often our patients end up on. Because I don't contract with insurance, none of these are requirements, but this is just examples of what my patients do. A lot of people have high deductibles. A lot of them have health savings accounts. Some of them do faith-based sharing plans. There are a few examples of DPC practices that are partnered with insurance companies on exchanges. Employers have a ton of flexibility. They can actually kind of create custom health benefits, including DPC, around other insurance products. So this can play out in a lot of different ways in terms of where does insurance come into play with this. So who are my patients? I think there's a lot of stereotypes. Whenever, especially early on when I would describe my practice, I would get 2 reactions which were polar opposites. I would get, well, that would work really good for poor people who don't have insurance. And then I would get, oh, you're catering to the country club. And the answer was yes to both. I have patients at both ends of that spectrum. I have way more patients who are on the lower economic scale than on the upper. About 50% of my patients are uninsured and probably less than median income. I would describe them as the working poor, which I kind of find offensive growing up working poor, but that's what we call them, I guess. A majority, like I said, I have about 620, 630 patients. About 10% of my patients are from small employer partnerships. As I mentioned, I'm about a quarter children. Lawrence is a college town. around pretty young. So I think my average age, and it's been a while since I crunched this number, is around 38 or 40. So a lot of younger families, but definitely have some geriatrics. My oldest patient's 94 right now. So my average day, what does it look like in my clinic? Mike, a student, could describe this. Although he's only been here for what, 1 or 2 days? 1 day. Okay, never mind. He's a terrible storyteller. So my average day, I probably average about 6 to 8 clinic visits a day, and that'll come in waves. I mean, some days I'll have 2 or 4, and some days I'll have 10. But the big difference is, although that seems like a really low number, I care for patients remotely whenever it's feasible. So probably 50% of my practice is just on talking to patients. We sometimes lump this all together and call it telemedicine, which usually lives outside of the primary care practice, and this is some other company or some other provider who's doing this telemedicine thing on the side, but it's kind of integral to the way that my practice works. So I say I have 6 to 8 remote communications and 6 to 8 clinic visits a day. So maybe number of encounters is not that much different than what a regular practice is, but probably a little lower. I have lots of time to learn, investigate, and coordinate, and I think that's huge. When you get out in the real world and primary care and you're seeing 20, 30, 40 patients a day, if you're urgent care, 60, doctors see lots of interesting things, and believe it or not, you won't know everything when you graduate here, nor when you graduate residency. In fact, you won't even know a quarter of what you need to know. I only know like 27%, and I've been out 6 years. So the difference is I do have some downtime, and when I have a difficult patient, I can actually get on up to date and read for 20 or 30 minutes, often with the med students. So I love that, and I have the time to do that. I don't feel like I don't understand this, I'm referring it to cardiology. I try as best as I can to learn and help patients without doing that. It actually allows me to care for a higher acuity of illness. So because my schedule is much more open than what the regular rushed primary care practice is, if people call in and say, like, I think I broke my wrist, I can usually see them in the next couple hours, which is better than what they'll get in the ER. So for the most part, I think it allows me to do things like wound care and fracture management and more high acuity stuff because I'm not triple booked throughout my day. After hours call, people say, oh my gosh, you're on call 24/7, that's got to be exhausting. Well, number one, my patient panel size is smaller than average. And really the difference is not just the numbers, but my patients know me and I know them really well. So it's a big difference between taking care of 500 strangers and 500 patients you know pretty well. And so I rarely get called after hours. It's actually quite surprising, even after 6 years of doing it. And when it is, it's usually something pretty simple and I can fix pretty quickly. Like every patient in Lawrence has influenza now, every single one. There's 100,000 cases right now, I swear. I have my macros to respond on that one. So like, here's the deal with Tamiflu. It may or may not work. I don't know. Hope you guys can answer that someday. So what is the state of the current DPC movement? As I said, there's probably about 600 to 800 DPC practices. The community is exploding, and there's dozens at least opening every month, so it's hard to keep an exact number of that. There's some surveys that were done by a few organizations that said 20 to 30% of primary care docs were considering DPC. Now, what that means, I don't know, but I think there's a good percentage that are seriously either considering or planning opening a DPC practice. There's lots of national organizations and conferences and workshops. I'm involved actually in just recently launching a direct primary care organization, but some of the other more well-known ones, American Academy of Family Physicians here in Kansas City, the ACOFP, both sponsor an event called the Direct Primary Care Summit, which is now in its 5th year, which kind of draws together a lot of the DPC doctors and people who are wanting to do it to teach them how. A lot more national media coverage, which I've had the privilege of having some of that, and that's awesome. I don't know how many primary care doctors get the chance to talk to 10 million people about primary care. It's usually dressed up in some kind of weird political way, but it gives this like awesome opportunity for me to, regardless of whether you buy into DPC, to say, here's why primary care matters. And so that's usually what I try to do when I get those microphones. And that's really cool. And I think even some of the large organizations are jealous of that. Okay, the big picture. Oh man, this is the tough one. I don't know where that's at. Anyone knows? Somewhere in Europe? There you go. You guys are more cultured than I am. I was going to guess it was Joplin, but. Yeah. Okay, so what are the problems with DPC? And I'm happy to address all of these head on. So again, as I mentioned, a lot of people's response is, well, yeah, primary care is good and all, but what about neurosurgery? Well, how could this possibly work with insurance? If insurance covers it, why would you cover it? Or why would you do it in a different way? Well, what about people who can't afford it? Well, this will worsen the primary care shortage. I heard this one this morning, which is a great thought. Wouldn't this worsen the coordination of care because you're not part of this well-oiled, I'm a commentary here, magical system that's super coordinated? I haven't seen that yet, but in theory it could happen because of insurance. So if you're off the grid, how can you possibly coordinate with specialists and hospitals and all that stuff? You know, if we just have a bunch of cowboy doctors out there who aren't being supervised, like aren't they going to, you know, not provide standards of care? Aren't they going to stray away from evidence-based medicine? So these are all kind of the, and I'm sure the list is longer than this. PowerPoint allows me to do 6. So this is kind of the you know, the critiques of DPC that I hear, and I'll go through them, I think, here, hopefully. So I think the first thing to realize is that, you know, primary care is primary care. Primary care is not neurosurgery. Primary care is not a neonatal intensive care unit. It is not hemodialysis. It is not a nurse educator talking about diabetes. It is not a vaccine. It is not a medicine. It is a thing into itself. And healthcare is this really complicated industry, and it looks different depending on the type of care. So I think a lot of people, they just kind of say healthcare and they mean it all as this one huge thing, and it's not. It's way more complicated. And I think the thing to realize, most importantly, is that if primary care was highly valued and functioning in the way that it should, most people, most years of their life would not need anything more than primary care. I throw a number out here, which I believe is called spitballing, but 70% of people, 70% of the years of their lives will probably not need much more than that. There are certainly some truly chronically ill people who will need lots of specialists, and there's certainly years in a person's life where they may need an opinion of someone who's not a primary care doctor. But for the most people, most years of life, that's probably all they'll need. And then I said specialty care is huge, wide variant. Specialty care anywhere from the, you know, the pathologist giving a quick interpretation to a dermatologist looking at a rash to a cardiothoracic surgeon doing a 8-hour surgery. So there's huge variance there. Obviously, hospitalizations and facilities and surgeries can be, you know, a huge thing. And then you have all the ancillary stuff, labs and meds and radiology equipment. And the reason I mention all this stuff is because I think you have to kind of break all this stuff down as opposed to thinking about like healthcare as this one thing. And so how do we pay for all that? You know, so you see that list of things, and some of those things are relatively cheap, and some of those things, you know, a day in the cardiac ICU is, you know, $15,000. So how do we pay for that stuff? And I think that's what we're kind of getting at with this whole insurance thing. So what is insurance? So to kind of back up and think about this in a non-healthcare world, most people when they use the word insurance, and I believe like if you look in Merriam-Webster's, would say something like this, that insurance is a financial tool or arrangement, that people who are a holder of an insurance policy are paying smaller amounts, you know, over a period of time for the possibility of an uncertain event. And if that event happens, you know, which is probably something that's unlikely, would it make sense for then that insurance policy to then cover that, to pay for that? And so to kind of meet that criteria for that to make sense, for the most part, if you look at other industries and how we do insurance, it's something that's got to be relatively unexpected, and it's got to be expensive. You know, no one would insure their lunch. I don't like what some sandwich shops pay or charge me for lunch, but it wouldn't help me to insure it. We wouldn't use our insurance to pay for oil rotations or to put gas in our car, although we don't like paying for those things. And some people can't afford some of those things. So if that event happens, whatever it is, your house burns down, you total your car, you die, what and who gets reimbursed? So that's a whole other, you know, the payment mechanism of insurance is a whole other thing. But I think the first thing to think about is like, when does that make sense? When does that trade-off of that arrangement make sense between the policyholder and whoever's the insurance company or the government body doing that? So what we have now, I already alluded to this, is we do it for all things. We do it for a stubbed toe, we do it for brain cancer, we do it if you get ran over by a bus, we do it to educate people about diabetes, and you wrap this all up together and it's managed care. Examples of there, Medicaid, Medicare, PPOs, HMOs. 95% of people in America are in some form or another of managed care. Basically, if they have insurance, they're probably in a managed care system. Most of it is structured as a fee for service, meaning the third party who's holding that money will pay X for Y, and they get to determine what, you know, what that value is worth. The strange part in our system is that doesn't mean that the patient doesn't pay anything. In fact, 70% of people in a given year will not meet their deductible. Obviously, that makes sense because if everyone met their deductible every year, insurance wouldn't make sense as a business. So 70% of people are still going to be on the hook for whatever those payments are, and we call that out of pocket, which I think is a funny term because I'm pretty sure premiums come out of people's pockets too. But so it's still managed kind of in the payment, and all of that paperwork is still managed within that system, but the patients ultimately are writing the checks when they need the care. And this is something, although there's been a slight change here, I think I have a graph on this, the percentage of third-party payment as a total has been steadily increasing since 1970. And I think a lot of people perceive the opposite is true, that insurance covers less and less. And in fact, statistically, that's not true. If you add up all the amount of money that we spend on healthcare, patients as a percentage spends less on that percentage than ever before. So, and obviously that has some effects on the provider operations, which is where I started with all of this. So if you look at the growth of managed care, so there's 2 lines here, and I'll try not to screw this up. I think I did last time. So out-of-pocket spending, which means the total amount. This includes the premiums and when people actually need care and the payments to doctors. So here's 1965. Managed Care Act is about right here. Medicare is about right here. So the amount of out-of-pocket spending in America, and this only goes to like 2012, and actually there's been a slight increase. I think it's up to like 15% now because of increasing high deductibles. But for the most part, historically, patients are spending less out of their own pockets, and this is federal and state spending, but this is also true of private insurance spending, has gone up and up and up. So as a total, we're actually, everyone's paying for all of this on the front end, but on the back end of things, out-of-pocket costs have actually gone down. So what are the ethics of managed care? Yeah.
But that isn't a graph about premiums. So that's only out of pocket. So talk about premiums.
Premiums have sky, I mean, as everyone knows, premiums, the total pot has grown enormously. Yeah, so the point I said, thank you, Marcy. I knew I'd have someone correcting technical. So what she's saying here, and this is a good point. So this is not the total amount that we spend. This is percentages. So the y-axis, right? God, yes, thank you, Marcy. The y-axis over here is the percentage. This isn't a total amount. So yeah, we all know that healthcare, I don't even know what the percentage of inflation since 1970 is, 8 gazillion%, give or take. Correct, yes. So this is really, maybe this isn't the best way to show this, but this is a percentage graph here and not a total amount. So yeah, the total costs for everyone have gone way up, but yeah. The point I was making is that, although we have increasing deductibles, we're still, as a percentage, not as high as what historically maybe we were. So what are the ethics of managed care? I'm supposed to talk about ethics here. I have a degree in public health, so I'm not sure I'm qualified, but I'll try, right? So who does the provider work for? So in managed care, is the patient the one the provider's working for? Maybe, maybe not, but they're not the one, as a percentage, as that graph shows, they're not the ones actually paying the bill. What are the interests of those third parties? So what are the financial interests? What are the, is the third party actually looking out for the well-being of the patient? What are the values of that third party versus the patient? Obviously, there's a lot of social stuff that gets wrapped into that. Are those managed care organizations really setting evidence-based standards? That's one of the things they're supposed to do, but are they doing it? Historically, you can look and make that determination. They're supposed to assure or measure quality, outcomes, quality of care. That's kind of one of the big selling points for managers, is they're making sure us rube primary care doctors are doing it right. The moral hazards of that, obviously, I think you could go into. And obviously, when you have a managed care, there's a lot of politics. When you put a big pot of money together, we all have to get together, and we do this every few years, and we argue about what should be covered and what shouldn't be covered. Just turn on the news. So self-pay, what does that mean? It's a kind of a weird term, but I use it here. So for the vast majority of human history, healthcare has been self-pay. People or their families or their communities paid the doctor. There wasn't like a third party there writing a check. There wasn't such thing as co-pays or deductibles or any of that stuff. And so I think that you have to ask some questions there too. Who's accountable to whom? The doctor is kind of there with a lot of autonomy, as I mentioned, one of the things I wanted. And who's there to assure the quality of care? There's a huge knowledge gap between myself and the patient, although a lot of patients think they know more than me. But that's okay. It's part of my job. So most of the time, I hope that I know more than my patient that I'm advising. And so that, that kind of creates an uneven ground for knowledge. And there's potential for fraud. I mean, who's to say that I don't order 7 million MRIs on the patient because I want to make money? Another question that comes up is in the DPC world is what if someone can't pay? And I think if you look at this on a very basic level, that's obviously going to vary a lot. And there's a lot of different ways you can look at that threshold. That you can look at that per person, per event. As I mentioned earlier, private plans, 70 to 80% of people do not meet their deductible. And so there may be some first dollar coverage in there, so some preventive care, but that's usually in the hundreds of dollars of coverage. There's a few examples more than that. But the vast majority of people are not, getting all of this amazing stuff on the back end. If they get to the end of the year and they haven't met their deductible, then, I guess they're on the other side of that. Who's funding the insurance plan? So that's kind of what we do right now is if someone is lower income and they can't afford care, we fund either the government plan or the private plan, which is done in my state. And we tell them to take care of people in a managed care arrangement. Again, insurance, this is one of those things, like the word insurance, I keep harping on this, but the word insurance gets wrapped up in a lot of different things. And I think a lot of times people equate insurance to assistance for the poor. There's other ways we could assist the poor, and I always like to point this out, and it seems like, well, no, duh. But I think in healthcare, like, we just can't fathom another way. In food assistance, we give people a cash benefit. They can go shop at Dillon's or Hy-Vee or their Kroger or their grocery store of choice. So there's other ways we could assist people, and there's a few examples of that happening, but for the most part, that's not how it's arranged now. The future of American healthcare. Man, that's a very empty ball, isn't it? My mission when I started my practice was to take really good care of my patients, and I did not, because I had good teachers, realized how messed up our system is. And I didn't have a lot of faith, through my training and looking into my crystal ball here, that American healthcare was going to be better, at least not from the powers that be, not from people who have been trying to reform it and fix it for a long, long time. So, I mean, that's been my motivation, was to create my practice and to care for my patients and be the best doctor I could be for my patients. And I realize there's tons of other moving parts to our system, and direct primary care is not a solution for every single one of those. I realize that in order for this type of model to be applicable and work for everyone, and maybe it won't. Maybe I should back up there. I don't know if DPC is the model for everyone all the time. But I think for models like this, outside of the managed care system, I realize there's a lot of other things that need to change. But those are very complicated things, and I could talk for hours and hours about that, and I'm sure I'll get some questions here. But that's kind of my thought process, is I could get up here and give you my grand vision of the healthcare system and maybe ways we could do things more efficient and better from A to Z. But I have like a 40-page paper somewhere on the internet that says that. All right, this is me. This is how you contact me. Email, Twitter, website. If you have any questions, I'll field them now, or you can find me online. I saw this guy move to the front row, so I knew he was going to ask a question.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. I have 1,000,000,001 questions, but the first one that comes to mind is, I think insurance has to be just a big parable of healthcare, because you need it, because medical care is expensive, just period. The resources are expensive.
I'll back up to that.
It's expensive everywhere. It's not just a problem in the United States. I mean, it's the reason other countries do well is because they're better able to, spread out the risk. So, my question really is, how do you compel somebody to buy a subscription for primary care? Because as I understand it, most people don't go to the primary care, don't go to their PCPs unless there's some sort of disease that they're struggling with, or an element of moral hazard that, hey, I'm paying for this, why aren't I going to see my doctor? Or the third category of people are who actually have chronic health problems and use the primary care doctor as a pathway to see specialists. So there still needs to be an element of compulsion, and I'm just wondering, how do you get that and still kind of remain
So the first point, yeah, there's a lot of points wrapped up there. But the first point you made was that all healthcare is inherently expensive. I don't know if that's true. Some healthcare is, as I mentioned. I think that we have seen, and this is probably more true in America, but probably true in other places in the world, that a lot of the inflation for medical care is because of the complex payment models. That the actual act of running a CT scanner and buying a CT scanner and mating it is not near as expensive as what you think it is. Now, the way that the industry is structured is that there's a lot of people in that industry who aren't actually delivering care. My first point was I don't know if all medical care is so expensive we all can afford it. And I think by having that train of thinking is why we're where we're at. So let me give you another example. So if we, I don't know why I talk about sandwiches, probably because I'm hungry. But so if we told Subway that they must do all these extra things that don't necessarily produce a sandwich, but they need to do whatever it is to make sure the sandwich is safe, and there was like 17 people behind, sandwich artists, I believe is what they're called, behind the counter making a sandwich, that price of that sandwich would be way higher. You're still getting a sandwich. And I think that's the corollary. In healthcare, there's a lot of circumstances where there's this huge amount of administrative stuff that is not healthcare. And I don't think it's because of technology. I don't think it's because healthcare has to be that expensive.
I'm not disagreeing there. I'm saying we're operating in that world where healthcare is expensive for those exact reasons, and then how direct care functions within. So with that in place, but I mean, if healthcare weren't expensive for the exact same reasons you were mentioning, then concierge model would be just perfect then for everyone. You just go to the doctor when you need to.
Well, I think there's always that threshold, as I mentioned. There's some things that are going to be inherently expensive. Intensive care, because of the amount of labor and facility costs and that type of stuff, yeah, some of that stuff is going to be expensive. But I think if you start with the premise that stuff could be much more affordable, that helps everyone, whether they're paying themselves or whether they're receiving government assistance to purchase that, whether it's A, G, or Z. If the costs are less, you can help more people. If the costs are less, that burdens individuals and families less. So I mean, that's kind of my working thought on this, is that there's a lot of artificially inflated prices. And if you accept the fact, if you accept that it's just a fact that medical care has to be this expensive, then yeah, I guess we can all keep doing what we're doing and argue who pays for it. But what I'm challenging is not so much who pays for it, but how it's paid for.
What about the compulsion to purchase?
Yeah.
Go to your specialist, and then
it depends. I mean, so some specialists, let me give you an example here. So some specialists actually are not that expensive. So I use a specialist teleconsultant platform called Rubicon MD. Don't have stock in them, not a spokesperson. But they do this amazing thing where they have gathered together a group of specialists. I think most of them are on the East Coast, but they have them all across the country now, where it's kind of like a private Facebook for primary care practices, and they use a lot of DPC practices, where I can go on and ask these specialists an opinion of my patient. Now, this is all done remotely, but I could share a picture, a story, lab value, images, and ask them. And I pay a monthly subscription fee to access those specialists. My patients, I don't charge them for it all. So some specialists may not be that expensive. But what you're asking is there, at what point in time do we have that kind of financial safety net? And there needs to be compulsion? I mean, maybe. I mean, taxes are a compulsion by their nature. Yeah, but yeah. So there's a lot of things we can compulse people to do, and I think that you could create a safety net, and probably taxes, which are compulsory, are going to be involved in that. So yeah, at the end of the day, maybe there has to be something like that. But that's a difference between compulsing people to like use an existing system, which is very expensive and terrible. But yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay, sorry, I got the mic. My question is, you see 630 patients, or you have a panel of 630 patients. I'm right here.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was like, what? My LASIK is failing me.
And a normal primary care physician sees somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 patients. What happens to those other 1,500 patients, 2,000 patients? So how?
Well, they never existed for me. That range there, I would ask the same question. So the doctor who decided in their practice to take care of 1,500 or 2,000, what happened to those other 1,000 patients? Like I said, I know a doctor whose panel size was more than 4,000. They ran a very efficient practice. So I would say the same kind of question would apply. Is you know, what is that number of obligation to care? I don't have a number. I think we should leave that up to physicians. It will vary based upon so many different factors. Historically, to give some context to this, and I think, you know, there's not very many studies, but the few things I've seen on this is before the mid-1970s, the average primary care doctor panel size was probably less than 1,500, 1,200 to 1,500. And so I don't know if that's the magic number. I don't know if 4,000 is. I will tell you that most practices will tell you they have way too many patients and they can't serve their needs the way that they should. So, yeah. Uh-oh, someone cut in front of you.
I was just kind of curious, what's the blowback you guys have been having from insurance companies? Because obviously you're kind of going into their market.
Directly, none. So, I mean, we're still a small percentage of primary care doctors. Most estimates say 2 to 3%. So I don't think we're, you know, in an economic sense, like a big enough threat to probably prompt a lot of stuff. There has been a few states where the direct primary care legislation that has been passed is this very simple thing that says we're not health insurance. It's not a direct threat to the insurance industry, but they have, in a few states, kind of weighed in on it and are opposed to defining us not as insurance. Although I operated in this model before Kansas had a law, and there's a lot of other practices that are operating without such protections. So there's been a few examples where they've kind of officially gone on the record about this. The strange thing is, in recent year, there's been several insurance companies who've actually started using the phrase direct primary care around the country. They started opening their own clinics, and one of them is actually using the word direct primary care, which is just mind-boggling, and my head's going to explode. And so some of this terminology gets pretty confusing because there's going to be clinics that are called DPC that are owned by Blue Cross. So that will get really interesting when they start challenging definitions and stuff if they're using the phrase as well. So, yeah. Can I duck under the desk for this question?
No. With full disclosure, Ryan is my former student, one of my favorite former students.
Oh, goodness.
And I live in Lawrence, Kansas, and I visited his super cool clinic, and I love primary care. But a couple of points to clarify. So, on average, a primary care doc has 2,000 on their panel. 4,000 is cuckoo crazy and well outside of the bell-shaped curve. So
yes.
So on average, a primary care doc in this country has about 2,000 folks that they take care of.
And even how they define that's kind of funny.
Yeah, and most of them don't come in. So what happens in a DPC world is that we have a really hard time. Back up for a minute. We have a really hard time getting those patients to come in for preventive services. We've made them free through the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah.
That still hasn't resolved all of the issues. DPC practices do have insurance companies worried, super worried. They just aren't telling you about it.
I'm trying to downplay it, Marcy.
Okay, they're worried, and
I'm naive, but not that naive.
And that's okay. I want them to be worried. I mean, our system is still broken, but I guess one of the questions I'd have for you, Ryan, and want to make sure everybody here is aware of, the DPC practices that are working and the DPC practices that aren't have a couple of trends that they're trying to manage. So let's use Q Alliance.
Yes.
Really having a hard time getting DPC to work in their environment in Seattle without partnering with employers.
Well, so I know Erica and Garrison pretty well, and I've talked to them a lot. And both of them have restarted DPC practices, by the way, already. Both of them have solo DPC practice. So they're back where they started. Now, what she's talking about is Q Alliance, which was my inspiration. Garrison was my inspiration, and Eric as well. So they attempted to scale their practice really large, and there's been a couple other examples of this. And scale means they wanted a big practice with dozens of primary care patients and tens of thousands of patients. So Q Alliance in particular accepted venture capital. You have to have a lot of money in investment to do that, to grow. And so they did that, got a lot of money, tens of millions of dollars to grow a primary care practice, which is kind of crazy world. No one else in primary care gets that kind of money. So that's great. And in order to scale, they started started making contracts that a lot of DPC practices wouldn't have done. The biggest one was they contracted with a Medicaid managed care company in the state of Washington to pay their fees. So a lot of people hear my spiel and they say, well, that'd be great if someone else just paid the bill. And this is what Q-Liance did. I think there was some trepidation in doing that, but there was a huge potential to grow the practice and business, and they did that. They had 16 or 18 doctors, maybe up to 20 at one point. And then some of that relationship with the managed care organization in the state of Washington went downhill, started playing some hardball stuff. Venture capital pulled out. You can't sustain a business built on venture capital when the venture capital pulls out. So yes, it failed, but I think it was trying to scale in a way that most DPC practices are not. My vision has always been that DPC practices will be these small community-based things, that there won't be a MIC DPC.
And that was
that's
point
been
that I was
my point.
really
And so, unfortunately,
driving
those
at.
few failures that happened in the media, Q-Liance, Turntable, which you guys know ZDogg. So you know ZDogg? So ZDogg had a DPC clinic in Las Vegas. I was on his show one time. He's as crazy as he is on his videos. He's awesome though. But so he had a DPC practice and it failed. So he had a huge venture capital. There's another company called Iora, which is probably the largest DPC company, although they've done a lot of stuff that doesn't fit the DPC mold. So a lot of these companies who kind of started off as these simple DPC models have attempted to scale their business. And with big reward comes some big risk, and some of them have failed. But in the media, these failures have been like, there's been 2 or 3 of these failures in the last year, and the media presents it as though the DPC market has failed because of 2 companies, which, I know some hospitals have failed, and I don't say the concept of a hospital is done.
One more question here.
So let me preface this by saying that we've noticed that in recent history, a lot of people are coming in with a lot more comorbidities, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
America.
America. Fast food, all that good stuff. That being said, right now you're using a capitated model for payment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you see that working with getting more patients that have higher acuity? I know you said earlier that because of your small panel or smaller panel, you can provide for those patients. But as we see healthcare and time progress, your level of acuity is going to increase with more of your patients. How is that going to affect your payment model?
Well, the math at the end of the day has to work out in terms of I have to be able to take care of my patients, and I have to have enough of them paying enough to make my business work. So that's true of any business model. That's true of fee-for-service world as well. So in the fee-for-service world, when these really sick patients come in, they can't care for them. They run them through 30 patients a day, and then they refer them. So that kind of moral hazard, that dilemma exists in any practice model. And I do think with what you're alluding to, that healthcare, the way it looks right now, is so much different than it was in 1960. People live with diseases for decades and decades and decades, and healthcare is a much more integral part of people's lives. There's these small touch points that happen on a frequent basis. Whereas in 1960, you got sick and maybe there's a surgery or medicine could save your life, or you died. That was healthcare. And so I think that when healthcare becomes this more kind of longitudinal thing, where you have these kind of point, that when you have this payment model, it allows for me to care for those patients better. And a lot of people with chronic diseases, I don't need to see them in clinic every time. In my diabetics, I would much rather get a weekly or a monthly report on their diabetes through the internet than have them come in every 6 months. 6 months is a ton of time for a diabetic. They could have fallen off the wagon 2 weeks after I left the clinic. They're, I'm gonna eat good, and then 6 months later, oh my God, what happened? Well, I did good for a week. So the way that I look at it is, because I'm not so reliant upon visits, that I actually am able to care more efficiently. But yeah, I couldn't do the same thing if I had 2,000 patients. There's not enough time in the day.
Do you think that in the future, maybe about 50 years from now, that will actually become an issue where direct primary care is going to have to compete with insurance companies at that same market value?
Yeah, that's complicated. What I would say is that technology, it's funny, technology should be enabling patients and doctors to do better in terms of clinical decision-making, clinical outcomes. And so what I hope to see in the future is that my practice becomes more and more efficient utilizing technology. I only adopt technology if it makes me more efficient, meaning it frees up my time. And so I think that that's kind of the difference is that, you know, I think with time and efficiency, I probably could get the 700, 800, maybe 1,000, like as I get to know my patients well. So my patients I've had for 3 years, even if they're the sickest people you can imagine, are a lot less work than the patients joined 6 months ago. You know, people joined 6 months ago, I hate to say it, but a lot of them are train wrecks. Even if they're not that sick, they just have these complicated medical histories and no one's really ever taking care of them. And so I have to sort everything out. So my goal is always to advance people to a level of near autopilot. If I can get people caring for themselves, then that frees up my time, allows me to focus more on the difficult patient at hand. So, yeah.
Everybody, let's thank our guest speaker. And if you do have further questions, note his email. These slides will be posted. Thank you.
Or you can just throw some shade at me on Twitter.
I wasn't. No, I'm actually, believe it or not, I'm actually on your side.
Great.
Yeah, I actually have an MPH, and I'm
Oh, you do?
going into primary care.